The auction, the air in Nick Station's lower levels, tasted like desperation and decay. Captain Sarah Chen pulled her worn jacket tighter as she navigated through the maze of illegal market stalls, each breath burning her lungs with a cocktail of recycled atmosphere and alien pheromones that marked this place as somewhere decent people didn't venture. She shouldn't have been here at all. Her salvage ship, the Meridian, was held together by hope and spare parts. Her credentials were 3 days from expiration, and her account balance made zero look generous. But Mercer's cryptic message had been impossible to ignore. Last chance opportunity. Something you need to see. The auction was already underway when Sarah found the right stall. A hulking Vascan auctioneer gestured with 4 arms at various cages and containers, while a sparse crowd of buyers showed little interest in the exotic specimens on display. Moving to lot 279, the auctioneer announced, tapping a rusted cage with one massive finger. Damaged specimen wingless drake from the Cygnus ruins. Non-functioning flame sacs, but intact vocal apparatus. Previous owner claimed language capacity, though we've observed no vocalizations. Sarah's attention snapped to the cage. Inside, barely fitting in the cramped space, was a creature unlike anything she'd seen in 15 years of salvaging the galaxy's forgotten corners. About the size of a large dog, it had dull gray-brown scales and a long neck that curved downward in what looked like the feet. Where wings should have been, only vestigial nubs remained on its shoulders. A crude restraint bound one front limb, and around its neck hung a tarnished collar that pulsed with faint blue light. Bidding starts at 80 credits, the Vascan continued. The crowd's interest visibly waned. One buyer muttered about uselessness, without flight capability. Another suggested it would barely yield enough genetic material to be worth processing. 70 credits, the auctioneer offered, already moving toward the next cage. 60. That's when the creature's eyes opened deep amber orbs with vertical pupils that contracted in the harsh light. It looked directly at Sarah, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Those weren't animal eyes. There was sharp intelligence there, an awareness that sent a chill through her. 55 for quick disposition, the Vascan said, clearly ready to move on. Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. The creature had raised one clawed hand slightly and was tracing deliberate patterns in the grime on the cage floor. Not random scratches, but symbols, 3 intersecting lines, then a circle, then what appeared to be primitive numerals in a script she almost recognized. It was writing. 50 credits for salvage, the auctioneer said with finality. I'll take it, Sarah heard herself say. 60 credits. The Vascan's compound eyes swiveled toward her, upper lids narrowing in surprise. 60 for the wingless drake. Any counter-offers? Silence. Sold to the human in the brown jacket. As the transaction processed through her already strained account, Sarah tried to look disinterested, like someone who just made a routine purchase, not someone who just committed to harboring what could very well be contraband under corporate preservation statutes. The cage was shoved into her arms, heavier than expected. Through the bars, those amber eyes watched her unblinking. Receipts in your account, the Vascan said. No returns, no guarantees. It hasn't eaten in 3 cycles, so don't blame me if it doesn't last. Sarah nodded and turned away, cradling the cage against her chest as she navigated through the market. Her heart pounded. What was she doing? She couldn't afford another mouth to feed, couldn't risk corporate attention. And yet, when she passed a stall selling maps and artifacts, something caught her eye, a partially unfurled star chart showing a region of space she'd never seen in standard databases. The chart depicted a small cluster of systems with unfamiliar designations, and at its center was a stylized image of a creature remarkably similar to the one in her arms. Beneath it was inscribed, Custodian Worlds. The creature in her cage followed her gaze, its body suddenly tense with alertness. Interested in precursor artifacts? The vendor asked. Reproduction, of course, but faithful to the original. Found in the Cygnus sector about 80 years back. Supposedly depicts territories of the Varth, though most scholars think they're mythical. Sarah's breath caught. The Varth she'd heard whispers of them in the deepest salvage sites. Rumors of an ancient race that had guarded something precious before vanishing from the galaxy. After some haggling, she secured the chart for 65 credits she didn't have and made her way to the docking bays, her mysterious purchase silent but alert in its cage. The Meridian felt like sanctuary after the market's chaos. As the airlock sealed behind her, Sarah set down the cage in the small galley and took a proper look at her impulsive acquisition. Up close, she could see that the scales weren't simply gray-brown, but held subtle patterns of bronze, copper, and deep blue. The wings were indeed vestigial, but the shoulder musculature suggested they had been removed rather than never developed. "I'm going to open this," she said, not sure if it could understand her. "I don't want to hurt you." She released the locking mechanism and stepped back. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then slowly, the creature uncurled and took a hesitant step forward, then another. It moved with surprising grace, despite its obvious weakness, balancing on powerful hind legs while keeping its front limbs partially raised. Once fully out of the cage, it began a careful examination of the galley, occasionally touching control panels with the tips of its claws. Sarah filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor. The creature approached cautiously, dipped one claw in the liquid, then finally lowered its head to drink. After satisfying its thirst, it looked up at her and made a soft trilling sound like distant wind chimes. "You need a name," Sarah said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "I can't keep calling you creature in my head." The dragonvore, that's what it was. Despite the missing wings, tilted its head and began tracing symbols on the metal floor. Sarah knelt down, studying the marks. They were similar to those on the collar and the star chart. Then, in careful, deliberate strokes, it wrote something that made Sarah's blood run cold. A single word in standard script, shaky but unmistakable. Help. First Contact Sarah stared at the words scratched into her ship's floor, her mind reeling. Help. Not only could the dragon understand her, it could write in standard script. You can communicate, she whispered. The dragon's amber eyes met hers, and it slowly nodded, a distinctly non-animal gesture that sent chills down Sarah's spine. It began tracing more symbols, alternating between the strange script from its collar and broken standard words. Taken. Home... Gone. Last. Sarah's throat tightened. You're the last of your kind? Another nod. The dragon's expression held such profound sadness that Sarah felt tears threatening. It continued writing, the effort clearly taxing its weakened state. Keepers of memory. Stars dying. Must return. Return where? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. The dragon lifted one clawed hand toward the star chart sheet. Purchased, now spread across her navigation table. It pointed to the center of the depicted star cluster, the Custodian Worlds. Sarah's hands trembled as she activated her ship's database, searching for any reference to the Varth or the Custodian Worlds. Most entries were classified or marked as historical speculation, but she found fragments archaeological reports. From the Cygnus sector, theoretical papers on pre-expansion civilizations, and most disturbing of all, corporate memos about preservation protocols for extinct species. They were hunting your people, she said, not really a question. The dragon's body language shifted, becoming more guarded. It wrote a single word. Still, Sarah's blood ran cold. They're still hunting? But you're the last. The dragon shook its head vigorously and pointed to itself, then held up one claw. Then it gestured to the star chart and held up several claws. There are others? Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. Other survivors. In the Custodian Worlds? A nod, followed by frantic writing. Hiding. Waiting. Promise to return. Sarah sank into her pilot's chair, overwhelmed. She'd stumbled into something far bigger than a simple salvage operation. The dragon, this Varth, was part of some ancient covenant, a living repository of knowledge from a civilization that had been systematically erased from galactic history. "What's your name?" she asked. "I can't keep thinking of you as the dragon." The creature considered this, then carefully traced symbols that Sarah couldn't read. She shook her head apologetically. "I can't read your script. Can you ... Can you choose a name I can pronounce?" The dragon tilted its head, seeming to understand the problem. After a moment, it wrote, "Kef." "Kef," Sarah repeated, and the dragon's eyes brightened. "I'm Sarah, Captain Sarah Chen of the salvage vessel Meridian." Kef attempted the name, producing a sound that was close to Sa-Ra, but with harmonics that made it almost musical. It was the first time Sarah had heard it vocalize. Beyond the wind chime trills. Over the next few hours, as Sarah's ship drifted in Nyx Station's outer docking ring, she and Kef developed a rudimentary communication system. Kef's standard vocabulary was limited but growing, while Sarah began recognizing some of the simpler Varth symbols. What emerged was a story that shook her understanding of galactic history. The Varth had been the galaxy's first spacefaring civilization, spreading not as conquerors, but as caretakers. They had established the Custodian Worlds as repositories of knowledge, preserving the cultures and discoveries of younger species who would eventually rise to join them among the stars. But the expansion had come too fast, too aggressively. Corporate interests saw the Varth territories as obstacles to development, their preservation efforts as impediments to progress. What followed was not war, but systematic elimination. The Varth were too few and too peaceful to resist effectively. Scattered, Keth wrote, his movements becoming more agitated. Hidden on colony ships, sold as curiosities, studied in laboratories. "How many are left?" Sarah asked. Keth held up both hands, spreading his claws wide, then closing them to just 3. 13. In the entire galaxy, only 13 Varth remained alive, and most of them were imprisoned in the Custodian Worlds, waiting for someone to fulfill an ancient promise, to return their scattered people home. Sarah's comm system suddenly chirped with an incoming priority message. Her blood chilled when she recognized the sender. Helix Corporation, the largest military contracting firm in the sector. "Ms. Chun," the message began, the corporate logo rotating slowly on her screen. "Our records indicate you recently purchased specimen lot 279 from Nyx Station's secondary markets. We wish to inform you that this specimen may be of archaeological significance and request immediate surrender for proper scientific study. Compensation will be provided." The message continued with legal jargon about corporate preservation protocols and the consequences of non-compliance, but Sarah had stopped listening. Kef had gone very still beside her, his amber eyes wide with fear. "They found us," she whispered. Kef began writing frantically. Not scientific study, vivisection. Extract memories before death. Sarah's stomach turned. She thought of all the archaeological specimens she'd seen in corporate research facilities over the years. Always assumed they were willing subjects or volunteers. Now she wondered how many had been like Keth's sentient beings harvested and dissected in the name of scientific progress. Her hands moved to the ship's controls without conscious thought. "Hold on, Keth. We're leaving." The Meridian's engines came online with a familiar rumble, and Sarah began the undocking sequence. Through the viewports, she could see other ships. in the station ring, including a sleek Helix Corporation cruiser that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. "They're already here," she muttered, pushing the engines to maximum thrust as soon as they cleared the station. Keth looked up from where he'd been studying the star chart. His writing, when it came, was urgent. Know the way. Can guide. But dangerous corporate patrols. Automated defenses. Sarah checked her navigation systems and calculated the distance to the Custodian Worlds. It would take them through 3 sectors she'd never explored, past regions marked as exploration prohibited. In her database. "Keth," she said, meeting his amber gaze. "If we do this, if we try to reach the Custodian Worlds, we'll be running from corporate security for the rest of our lives. There won't be any going back to my old life." Keth studied her for a long moment, then began writing with careful, deliberate strokes. Old life already gone. New life waiting. Together. Sarah smiled despite everything. Together, then. She plotted a course for the edge of the system, knowing that the moment they jumped to hyperspace, she would become a fugitive. But as she watched Keth carefully fold the ancient star chart, his movements reverent and hopeful, she realized she'd already made her choice the moment she'd seen intelligence in his eyes. The Meridian leaped into hyperspace, carrying its unlikely crew toward a destiny neither of them fully understood, but both were committed to face. The hunt begins 3 days into their journey toward the Custodian Worlds. Sarah's worst fears materialized on her sensor display. 2 Helix Corporation hunters had been shadowing them through hyperspace, their sophisticated tracking systems locked onto the Meridian's unique engine signature. "They're gaining on us," Sarah announced, her fingers flying over the navigation controls. "Our next jump will put us in the Kepler Nebula. It's dangerous, but the interference might help us lose them." Keth looked up from where he'd been practicing. Standard script on a data pad Sarah had given him. His writing had improved dramatically in just 3 days, as if the language was awakening dormant pathways in his mind. "Nebula is good," he wrote quickly. "Varth ships used nebulas to hide." "Remember old roots?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been through the Kepler Nebula before?" Keth nodded, then began drawing on the pad, not words this time, but a crude map. The lines showed safe passages through. A nebula, routes that avoided the worst of the electromagnetic storms and gravitational anomalies that made the region so treacherous. "How old are you, Keth?" Sarah asked as she adjusted their course to match his map. Keth's expression grew distant. He wrote several numbers, crossed them out, then finally settled on 212 years. "Young for VARth." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. 200, Keth. That means you were alive during the expansion. You saw your people's civilization fall." A slow, sad nod. Was student then, learning to be memory keeper. Never finished training. The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a cold blanket. Keth wasn't just the last of an extinct species. He was a witness to genocide, a survivor carrying the unfinished responsibilities of his entire culture. The Meridian dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler Nebula, and Sarah immediately felt the ship's systems strain against the electromagnetic interference. The hunters would have a much harder time tracking them here, but they would also have a harder time navigating safely. Keth moved to the co-pilot's seat, his clawed hands surprisingly gentle on the secondary controls. Without the collar, which Sarah had carefully removed using the ship's medical bay, his natural abilities seemed to be returning. He could sense gravitational fluctuations that Sarah's instruments couldn't detect, guiding them through pockets of space that looked empty, but would have torn the ship apart. "You're a natural navigator," Sarah observed as they avoided another hidden gravity well. "All Varth are," Keth wrote with one hand while continuing to pilot with the other. "Connected to space itself. How we found safe worlds for other species. They were 3 hours into the nebula when Sarah's proximity alarm screamed. One of the hunters had followed them in, accepting the risk to maintain pursuit. On the comm channel, a voice crackled through the interference. "Salvage vessel Meridian. This is Commander Hayes of the Helix exploration ship Vengeance. You are in possession of stolen corporate property. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded." Sarah muted the channel and looked at Keth. "Any ideas?" Keth's eyes were closed, his head tilted as if listening to something Sarah couldn't hear. Then his eyes snapped open, and he began writing urgently. "Storm coming. Big one. Follow me. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of Sarah's life." Keth guided them deeper into the nebula, toward a swirling mass of energy that looked like certain death. Behind them, the Vengeance continued its pursuit, its commander apparently convinced that Sarah would turn back rather than fly into what looked like a plasma storm. They were wrong. "Keth, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as arcs of energy began dancing across their hull. Keth's response was to take direct control of the ship, his hands moving over the controls with impossible precision. The Meridian twisted and dove through the storm, following currents of space-time that Keth could sense, but Sarah couldn't even detect. The Vengeance tried to follow, but wasn't as fortunate. Sarah's sensors caught a brief glimpse of the hunter ship as it was caught in a gravitational shear, its hull buckling before it managed to retreat from the storm. When they emerged on the far side of the nebula, battered but intact, Sarah slumped in her chair with relief. "How did you know we could make it through that?" "Varth built machines to map such storms," Keth wrote. "Data stored in genetic memory. Passed down through generations." Sarah stared at him. "You mean you actually remember things from before you were born?" A nod. "Memory keepers hold knowledge of entire species. Not just Varthol species we protected. Millions of years of history." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Keth wasn't just a survivor. He was a living repository of galactic history, carrying the memories and knowledge of countless extinct civilizations. No wonder Helix Corporation wanted him so badly. Over the next several days, as they traveled deeper into unexplored space, Keth began sharing fragments of this vast inherited knowledge. He told Sarah about the crystal singers of Altair Prime, who could communicate across star systems through harmonic resonance. He described the floating cities of the Magellan Worlds, where entire civilizations had lived in the atmosphere of gas giants. He spoke of the gardeners, who had been the galaxy's first terraformers, preparing worlds for species that wouldn't evolve for millions of years. All gone now. All remembered only in the genetic memory of the 13 surviving Varth. "The Custodian Worlds," Sarah said one evening as they shared a meal in the galley. "What are they exactly?" Keth considered this question for a long time before writing. "Libraries, museums, breeding centers. Places where we kept samples of everything: genetic material, cultural artifacts, recorded histories, sealed away until Galaxy was ready to remember." "And the other Varth, the ones who are still alive?" "Guardians, keeping the library safe, waiting for scattered ones to return." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Waiting for you." "Yes, but also waiting for decision. Libraries contain power to restore extinct species, rebuild lost civilizations, but also power to create weapons, to control evolution of entire worlds. If wrong hands find Custodian Worlds... He didn't need to finish. Sarah could imagine what would happen if corporations like Helix got their hands on that kind of technology. They would strip mine the accumulated knowledge of millions of years, turn it into profit and weapons. On their 7th day of travel, they reached the edge of the region depicted on the ancient star chart. Here, space itself seemed different, older somehow, marked by structures that didn't match any known architecture. Defunct orbital platforms hung in the void like monument to forgotten purposes, their surfaces covered in the same script that decorated Keth's collar. "We're getting close," Sarah said, studying the readings on her sensors. Keth nodded, but his posture had grown tense. He wrote, "Dangerous now. Automated defenses still active. Must prove we belong. As if summoned by his words, Sarah's tactical display lit up with proximity alerts. They were being scanned by something multiple, somethings that her sensors couldn't quite identify. The scans felt different from normal ship-to-ship identification protocols, more invasive, as if whatever was examining them was looking directly into their minds. Then, without warning, the Meridian was seized by invisible forces and pulled toward a massive structure that hadn't been there moments before. As they drew closer, Sarah could see it was a space station of impossible size and complexity, its surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to shift and flow like living text. "Keth," she said, her voice barely steady, "I think we've found the Custodian Worlds." Keth was staring at the station with an expression of joy and terror. When he finally managed to write, his handwriting was shaking. "Home. After so long. We made it home." Custodian Worlds. The docking bay that received the Meridian was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that responded to their presence. The air, when she cautiously opened, the airlock was sweet and clean, carrying scents of growing things and something that reminded her of old libraries and forgotten gardens. Keth stepped out first, his movements reverent and careful. The moment his feet touched the deck, the patterns on the walls brightened, and Sarah heard a sound like singing multiple voices, harmonizing in a language she didn't understand. "They know you're here," she whispered. Keth nodded, tears streaming down his scaled face. He began to vocalize, his voice joining the harmony with notes that seemed to resonate through the station itself. The song grew stronger, and Sarah felt a presence not threatening, but vast and ancient, like standing at the edge of an ocean. 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the far end of the docking bay. They were clearly Varth, but different from Keth in subtle ways. Their scales showed more complex patterns, and they moved with the fluid grace of beings who had never known captivity. Most striking of all, they had wings, not the vestigial nubs that marked shoulders, but full, magnificent wings that caught the light like stained glass. The eldest of the 3 approached, her movements slow and formal. When she spoke, it was in the Varth language, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's bones vibrate. Keth responded in kind, and switched to standard for Sarah's benefit. "This is the eldest, Vena. She asks why I've brought a human to the sacred spaces." Sarah stepped forward, unsure of the proper protocol. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen. I rescued Keth from a slave auction. He asked me to bring him home." Vena's amber eyes studied Sarah with an intensity that made her feel transparent. When she spoke, her standard was perfect, but accented with the same musical quality as Keth's. "You are the one who purchased him," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, but I freed him as soon as you paid currency for a person," Vena continued, her tone cooling. "You participated in the system that enslaves us." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know how it looks, but I was trying to help. I saw that he was intelligent, that he was being treated like an animal. And yet you completed the transaction that validated his status as property." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd spent the entire journey here thinking of herself as Keth's rescuer, but Vena was right. She had participated in the system that commodified sentient beings. Keth stepped between them, his voice urgent as he spoke in the Varth language. Vena's expression softened slightly, and she inclined her head, toward Sarah. "Keth speaks for you," she said. "He says you chose to help despite knowing the risks, that you sacrificed your own safety to return him to us. This has weight," Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. "Come," Vena said, gesturing toward the station's interior. "There are things you must see before we decide what to do with you." The journey through the station was like walking through a dream. Corridors curved in impossible directions, their walls covered in flowing text that changed as they passed. Gardens grew in zero gravity, their plants forming three-dimensional sculptures of living art. Libraries stretched beyond sight, their shelves holding not just books, but crystals that pulsed with stored memories, genetic samples suspended in stasis, and artifacts from civilizations Sarah had never heard of. "How long has this place existed?" she asked. "Since before your species learned to use tools," Vena replied. "We built it to preserve what would otherwise be lost to time and war." They entered a vast chamber where the other surviving Varth waited. Sarah counted 12 individuals, each showing the same careful dignity as Vina. Some were clearly ancient, their scales dulled with age, while others appeared younger than Keth. All bore the same marks of lost wings that had been clipped or removed, scars from captivity, the hollow look of beings who had seen too much. "The 13, Keth whispered. "All that remain." The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful. Each Varth greeted Keth with the same harmonic song, their voices weaving together in patterns that spoke of joy and grief intermingled. Sarah found herself crying as she watched, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in the simple act of coming home. When the greetings were finished, Vina addressed the group. They spoke in their own language for nearly an hour, and Sarah could see the debate was intense. Finally, Vina turned to her. "We have discussed your situation," she said. "Keth has told us everything about the auction, about the corporate hunters, about your decision to help him despite the personal cost. We believe you acted with honor, even if the circumstances were ... imperfect." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "The question now is what to do with you. You have seen our sanctuary, witnessed our numbers, learned of our purpose. This knowledge is dangerous, not just to us, but to the entire project we have spent millennia building." "I won't tell anyone," Sarah said quickly. "I understand the importance of what you're doing here." "We believe you," Vena replied, "but belief is not enough. The corporations that hunt us have methods of extracting information from unwilling minds. If you return to inhabited space, you will eventually be captured and everything you have learned here will be used against us. Double quotes. Sarah's heart sank. "So I'm a prisoner?" "Not a prisoner," one of the younger Varth interjected. "A choice." Vena nodded. "You may remain here, help us in our work, become part of our community, or..." She paused, looking at Keth. "Or you may choose to forget." "Forget?" Sarah asked. Keth stepped forward, his expression pained. "Memory adjustment. Not harmful, but ... complete. You would wake up in your ship at the edge of known space with no memory of the past few weeks. Your ship's logs would show a routine salvage operation that went wrong. You could return to your old life." Sarah stared at him. "And you? What would happen to you?" "I would remain here with my people. My wandering would be over." The weight of the choice settled over Sarah like a heavy cloak. She could return to her old life, continue scraping by as a salvage operator, eventually find a way to repair her ship and pay her debts. Or she could stay here in this impossible place and help preserve the accumulated knowledge of the galaxy's lost civilizations. "What kind of help would you need?" she asked. Vena exchanged glances with the other Varth. "We are dying," she said simply. "Our genetic diversity is too limited to sustain our species much longer. Within a generation, perhaps two, we will be extinct. But our purpose, preserving and protecting the galaxy's lost knowledge, will outlive us." You need someone to continue the work after you're gone, Sarah realized. Humans are adaptable, long-lived compared to most species, and have shown the capacity for both great creation and great destruction. Some of us believe that when the time comes, your species might be worthy inheritors of what we have built here. Sarah looked around the chamber at the 12 ancient beings who had spent their lives guarding the remnants of countless civilizations. Then she looked at Keth, whose amber eyes held both hope and resignation. If I stay, she said slowly, what would that mean? What would I be committing to? A lifetime of service, Vena replied. Learning our methods, understanding our technology, helping us preserve what can be preserved. And when we are gone, making the choice about what to do with the knowledge we have gathered. That's an enormous responsibility. Yes, Vena agreed. It is. But you have already shown the capacity for such responsibility. You saw a suffering being and chose to help, despite the cost to yourself. That is the fundamental requirement for our calling. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of her old life. The constant worry about money, the loneliness of space, the gradual decay of her ship and her dreams. Then she thought about what she had witnessed here, the beauty of the living station, the vast libraries of preserved knowledge, the quiet dignity of the Varth as they carried out their sacred trust. When she opened her eyes, Keth was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. If I stay, she said, will you teach me to read your language? The real one, not just the trade script? Keth's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him. I would be honored to teach you everything I know. Sarah turned to Vena. Then I'll stay. I choose to stay. The eldest nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Then welcome, Sarah Chen, to the Custodian Worlds. Your real education begins now. The final choice 5 years passed like a dream within a dream. Sarah learned to read the flowing Varth script, to navigate the living corridors of the station, to tend the impossible gardens that grew in defiance of physics. Under Keth's patient guidance, she began to understand the vast scope of the custodian's work, not just preserving artifacts and genetic samples, but maintaining the delicate balance that kept thousands of extinct civilizations from being truly lost. She learned to sing the harmonic songs that communicated with the station's bioneural networks, to interpret the genetic memories that the Varth carried like living libraries, and to make the terrible decisions about what could be saved and what had to be allowed to fade. But most importantly, she learned about the choice that was coming down it. Started with Vena's death peaceful, surrounded by her people, her last words a song that the station itself seemed to echo. Then Keth's mentor, the ancient keeper of the deep archives, faded quietly one morning while tending his crystal gardens. One by one, the 13 became the 11, then the 9, then fewer still. We always knew this time would come, Keth told Sarah as they stood in the memorial chamber where the patterns of the departed Varth were preserved in living light. The question was whether we would have found worthy successors. Sarah looked around the chamber at the 6 remaining Varth. All showed signs of the genetic degradation that was slowly killing their species scales, losing their luster, movements becoming more labored, the harmonic songs growing weaker. How long? She asked. Perhaps 2 years, Keth replied. Maybe 3 for the youngest of us. They were in the deep archives when the proximity alarms sounded for the first time in 5 years. Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized the energy. Signatures on the sensor display corporate hunter ships, more than a dozen of them, arranged in a search pattern at the edge of the system. How did they find us? She asked, her hands flying over the defense controls that Keth had taught her to operate. They didn't, replied Thurin, the youngest of the surviving Varth. But they're getting close. The pattern suggests they're following. Old hyperspace routes, checking each system methodically. Sarah studied the tactical display. The hunters were still days away from the station, but their search pattern was systematic and thorough. Eventually, they would find the Custodian Worlds. "We have to evacuate," she said. "Move the most important archives to another location." "There is no other location," Keth said quietly. "This station is unique in the galaxy. Its bio-neural networks, its quantum storage matrices, its connection to the stellar navigation grid, all of it is irreplaceable. Move the archives, and they become simple museums. Keep them here, and they remain living repositories." Sarah felt the weight of the decision settling over her. "So we fight? We six?" Theron laughed bitterly. "Against corporate battle fleets? Sarah, we are scholars, not warriors. The most violence any of us has ever contemplated is pruning overgrown memory vines." "Then what do you suggest?" The Varth exchanged glances, and Sarah recognized the look, the same expression they'd worn during those long debates 5 years ago when she'd first arrived. "There is another option," Keth said finally. "One we have prepared for, though we hoped never to use." He led her to a chamber she had never seen before, deep in the station's core. At its center stood a crystalline structure that hummed with barely contained energy, its faceted surfaces covered in the most complex Varth script Sarah had ever encountered. "The final archive," Keth explained. "Everything we have preserved, every memory we have gathered, every piece of knowledge we have maintained, all of it can be compressed into a quantum matrix and transferred to a single recipient." Sarah stared at the crystal, understanding dawning. "You mean transfer it to a person?" "To me, the process would give you access to the genetic memories of our entire species, plus the archived knowledge of every civilization we have ever protected. You would become, in effect, the last custodian of a living library containing millions of years of galactic history." "What would happen to you? To all of you?" Keth's expression grew sad. "The transfer process requires the willing sacrifice of the donors. We would become part of the archive, our consciousness preserved within the matrix, but no longer capable of independent existence." Sarah backed away from the crystal. "No, I won't let you die for this." "We're dying anyway," Theron pointed out gently. "At least this way, our deaths would have meaning." "But there has to be another way, Sarah." Keth's voice carried the harmonic authority of a master singer. "This is why we invited you to stay. This is what we have been preparing you for. The corporations will find this place eventually, and when they do, they will strip mine everything we have protected. The knowledge will be turned into weapons. The genetic samples will be used to create slave species. The cultural artifacts will be sold to private collectors. Unless," added another of the Varth, "that knowledge is hidden in the one place they would never think to look inside, the mind of a human salvage captain who officially died in hyperspace 5 years ago." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "I can't make this decision. It's too big, too important." "The decision was made when you chose to help me," Keth said softly. "Everything since then has been preparation. The only question now is whether you have the courage to complete what you started." The proximity alarms grew more urgent. The corporate fleet was accelerating, their search pattern tightening. In perhaps 18 hours, they would reach the station. Sarah looked around the chamber at the 6 beings who had become her family, her teachers, her purpose. She thought about Vena's quiet dignity, about the memorial chamber with its patterns of living light, about the vast libraries and impossible gardens that would be destroyed if the corporations found them. Then she thought about Keth in that rusty cage, writing help in the grime with one shaking claw, trusting a strange human to see him as more than property. "If I do this," she said finally, "what happens afterward? Where do I go?" "Anywhere," Keth replied. "Everywhere. You would carry our mission forward, deciding when and how to reveal what you know." You would become the bridge between what was lost and what might yet be saved. Sarah nodded slowly. And the station? The archives? Wiped clean and self-destructed. The corporations will find only empty corridors and dead technology. But the real treasures, those will live on in you. The decision, when it came, felt less like choosing and more like accepting what had always been inevitable. Sarah placed her hands on the crystal surface and felt its warmth pulse through her palms. "I'm ready," she said. The process was unlike anything she could have imagined. As the crystal began to glow, Sarah felt the memories of the Varth flowing into her mind, not as foreign thoughts, but as if she were remembering things she had always known. She saw the galaxy as it had been millions of years ago, watched civilizations rise and fall, experienced the joy of discovery and the grief of loss through the eyes of countless beings. When it was over, she stood alone in the chamber. The crystal had gone dark, and the station around her felt empty, not abandoned, but fulfilled, like a purpose completed. Sarah made her way to the docking bay where the Meridian waited, exactly as she had left it 5 years ago. But she was no longer the same person who had impulsively bought a caged dragon at a slave auction. She was something new, the last custodian, keeper of the galaxy's deepest secrets, guardian of its lost civilization's dot. As her ship cleared the station, Sarah watched through the viewports as the ancient structure began to dissolve, its bio-neural networks shutting down in carefully orchestrated sequence. By the time the corporate fleet arrived, they would find only empty space and the fading traces of an energy signature they could never identify. Sarah set course for the outer rim, her mind already planning her first steps. There were extinct species that could be restored, lost colonies that could be recontacted, injustices that could be corrected. She had work to do, the work of 13 lifetimes, compressed into one dot in her memory. She could hear Keth's voice, harmonizing with the songs of his people, reminding her that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is accepting a burden you never asked for. The Meridian jumped to hyperspace, carrying its precious cargo toward a future where the lost would not be forgotten, and the silenced would find their voices again. The end